Lady Jane Grey was proclaimed Queen of England and Ireland on the 10th of July 1553, following the death of her cousin Edward VI, and she patiently waited for her coronation in the Tower of London. Life, however, comes at you fast, as by February the next year Lady Jane Grey was facing the executioner's axe. This short time as Queen saw Lady Jane thrust into the crown by a series of scheming courtiers and politicians, which led to a reign that lasted just 9 days and was followed by the ascension of Mary Tudor, who went on a crusade to reverse the English Reformation. But why was the English Reformation such a big deal? Why was Lady Jane Grey put on the throne before Henry VIII's other children? And how exactly did the 9-day Queen lose the crown? Well, make sure to stick around because this short 7-minute documentary will cover all and more. And if you like this video, please subscribe and let me know in the comments if there are any other topics you would like to see me cover. Lady Jane Grey was the eldest daughter of Henry and Frances Grey and was born on October 1537, almost 30 years into the reign of her great uncle Henry VIII. This made her first cousin to King Henry's children, Edward VI, Mary I and Elizabeth I. Jane was given a strict upbringing and was provided with some of the best tutors of the time, being able to speak Latin and Greek from an early age. At just the age of 9, Jane was sent to live in the household of the late Henry VIII's final and surviving wife, Queen Catherine Parr, who had married Thomas Seymour, the brother of Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour. If you want to be even more confused, Thomas Seymour was the fourth husband of Catherine Parr, who was the sixth wife of Henry VIII. The Tudors definitely got around. Catherine Parr soon died due to complications with childbirth, and Jane was left in Thomas Seymour's care. Seymour was the uncle to the new young King Edward VI and had begun planning a marriage between the young king and Jane. But Thomas Seymour's plans were put on hold when he was beheaded for treason after breaking into the king's apartments and killing one of his dogs in a suspected kidnapping attempt in 1549. Yep, that confirms it. The Tudor era was full of nutters. Which brings us on to the peculiar circumstances that led to Lady Jane Grey bypassing the claims of Henry VIII's daughters Mary and Elizabeth on her way to becoming the shortest reigning monarch in British history. After a while, Jane's father was made the Duke of Suffolk, which meant Jane became a constant presence at the court of the young King Edward VI. Edward was just 9 at the time he was named king following his father's death, and if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know that meant a lot of the royal courtiers were vying for power and influence over the young king. There was also another aspect to the politics within the court, as there was still a clear split between those who supported the English Reformation and those who didn't. In case you didn't know, the English Reformation began under King Henry VIII when the Church of England separated from the authority of the Pope and the Catholic Church, and it was mainly driven by the Pope refusing to annul Henry VIII's marriages. However, the movement itself was popular in England on its own merit, and it gave Henry the chance to secure his support. The Church of England lent even more into Protestantism under the reign of Henry's son, Edward. Where it gets messy is when you look at Henry's eldest daughter, Mary, and the supposed next in line after Edward, who was an ardent Catholic and campaigned for the reversal of the Reformation. Once it became clear he was terminally ill, all efforts went into trying to remove Mary from the line of succession, with the Reformationists correctly assuming that she would try and reverse the Protestant reforms that took place during his reign. So when Edward died on the 6th of July in 1553, at the tender age of just 15, panic ensued among the court as plots were made to keep Mary from taking the throne. One thing that went their way was that both Mary and her younger sister Elizabeth were already kind of viewed as being illegitimate since the reign of King Henry VIII, after his marriages to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn were annulled. However, despite being seen as illegitimate, there was no other clear heir to the throne, so Mary was viewed as the presumptive heir, until Edward, at the age of 15 and close to death, composed a will lining out his own preferred line of succession in an attempt to preserve his Protestant legacy. Edward decreed that Mary and Elizabeth would be bypassed in favour of descendants of Henry VIII's niece and Edward's cousin, Frances Brandon. Frances had yet to give birth to any male descendants, but instead had 4 daughters, with the eldest being Lady Jane Grey. Edward specifically named Jane as the heir to his throne in his will, with many historians later believing that this was pushed by John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, who became a big figure in the race to install Jane as queen. When Edward did pass, his death was not announced for nearly 4 days, probably to give those around Lady Jane enough time to secure their claim. On the 3rd day after the king's death, Lady Jane Grey was informed that she was to be made queen, something she only accepted with great reluctance. It's clear that the move to make Jane queen was pushed more by the politicians and courtiers around her than any desire of her own, especially the aforementioned Duke of Northumberland. The next day, Jane was officially proclaimed Queen of England England and Ireland and took up residence in the Tower of London, which was the traditional residence of English monarchs while they awaited their coronation. While Lady Jane Grey was holed up in the Tower, the Duke of Northumberland took it upon himself to begin making moves to ensure Jane's succession. The most important task for Northumberland was to isolate and capture Jane's first and foremost threat, Mary Tudor. As soon as Mary heard of her half-brother Edward's death, she left her residence in Hertfordshire and began a tour to rally her supporters. Northumberland left London with troops as soon as he could with the aim to capture Mary. However, as he left the capital, the Privy Council, who were all signed as witnesses to Edward's final will, changed their allegiance and declared themselves for Mary instead. The consensus among historians was that this change of heart was spurred on by the overwhelming support for Mary among the English population. However, there's actually very little evidence there was this much support for Mary outside of Suffolk. It might have been the case instead that the coup was engineered by enemies of Northumberland within the royal court, led by Henry VIII, who had a personal feud with him. And just like that, the reign of Lady Jane Grey came to an end, with Jane becoming known as the 9 Days Queen. Lady Jane was imprisoned within the jailer's apartments in the Tower of London, agonisingly close to the apartments in which she had been living while waiting to be crowned, all while Mary arrived in London to assume the throne. By September that year, Parliament had declared that Mary was the rightful successor and revoked Jane's claim, naming her usurper. Jane was charged with treason and put to trial, unlike Northumberland, who was sharply executed after his capture, probably to make sure his influence in court ended for good. Jane's husband, his 2 brothers, and the former Archbishop of Canterbury were all put on trial under the same charges, and pretty unsurprisingly were all 5 found guilty and sentenced to death, with the sentence for Jane looking to be particularly gruelling, as the punishment for treason by a woman at the time was death by being burnt alive. However, there is evidence that the Queen had actually considered sparing Jane, as the Imperial Ambassador to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V reported that her life would be spared. However, once a rebellion began against Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain just a few months after Jane's sentence, in which her father and 2 brothers were part of, Jane's fate was sealed, as her still living posed too much of a threat to Mary. Jane was given 3 days' notice to give her a chance to convert to the Catholic faith ahead of her execution, presumably as a goodwill gesture by the new Queen Mary to allow her a chance to save her soul. On the 12th of February, Jane was taken from her rooms at the Tower of London to be publicly executed by beheading. Taken to the executioner's block blindfolded, Jane was allowed to make any last words, which she took the opportunity to ask forgiveness from God and recite a Bible verse, before granting the executioner forgiveness and resting her head against the block, where it was swiftly removed from her body in one clean stroke. Her body was taken to be buried alongside her husband's in an unmarked grave, who was also beheaded earlier that day. And that's Lady Jane Grey, beheaded at just 17 after becoming England's shortest reigning monarch, and is now remembered as the 9 Days Queen. But there is even some contention over that number, as if you counted her time as Queen from the day Edward VI died, she would have actually reigned for 13 days, which is a very unlucky number of days to reign for anyway, and would have left her as the shortest reigning monarch nonetheless. Either way, the short reign of Lady Jane Grey saw an unfortunate end, after having the throne thrust upon her by scheming politicians and courtiers, which ultimately saw her demise. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel, where I'll be making more content like this. I really appreciate you watching, and I look forward to seeing you again next time.